Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
Okay, welcome everyone. I just wanted to bring on Thomas Juneau and Stephanie Carvin to talk a little bit about the post-Trump landscape. Do you guys want to maybe start by introducing yourselves quickly, and we can go from there?
Sure. I'm Stephanie Carvin. I'm an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, where I teach in the areas of national and international security, as well as critical infrastructure protection. And I was a former national security analyst with the Government of Canada between 2012 and 2015.
And I'm Thomas Juneau. I'm a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, where I've been for just over 10 years. And before that, from 2003 to 14, I was an analyst with the Department of National Defense.
Awesome. We should also give a shout out to the Secure Line podcast, which Stephanie hosts with Jessica Davis and Leah West, which I think their first episode is up now. So go check that out as well. It's also probably a good idea to start by saying this episode is being recorded on January 27th at 11 a.m. On the 1-week anniversary of the Trump inauguration, almost to the hour. And just because things are moving quickly and we don't know what's going to happen by lunch. So just as a recap, this first week of the Trump presidency has involved the withdrawal of the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization, the declaration of a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border with deportation flights already underway, efforts to end birthright citizenship, although this seems like it'll probably be challenged in court or is already being challenged in court, the pardoning of 1,500 people involved in the January 6th insurrection, including some of the more violent individuals, as well as one bare-chested QAnon shaman, the rolling back of protections for transgender individuals, the dismantling of federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which are already having some kind of several bureaucratic fallout, an almost trade battle with Colombia after it refused to accept deported migrants from the U.S., an Episcopal bishop who urged Trump to show mercy and be kind to marginalized communities was met with threats and online slander, and of course, an enthusiastic Nazi salute by Elon Musk, who is said to head the Department of Government Efficiency. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have.
You forgot the National Institute of Health is frozen, and we don't know the future of that either. So yeah,
and
it's a lot.
Frozen-aid is frozen too. Foreign aid is frozen.
Foreign aid is frozen.
Oh, in the Gulf, it's now the Gulf of America.
Yes. Or the Gulf of Fragile Masculinity, as some online memes have put it. So I wonder if we can start by looking back to November, actually. It's been 2 months out since the election. How have you guys started to diagnose what happened there? Like, did it surprise you? How have you kind of made sense of it 2 months out?
If I'm honest with you, I haven't wanted to think about it very much. I've been trying to do everything I can to distract myself in some ways. But look, he was clear. I think for me, in the area that I research in, the thing that I'm most interested in and moderately terrified by is the extent to which we have seen young men in particular turn to Donald Trump and vote for him. And he captured, I believe, more than 50% of men under the age of 30, right? And we always kind of assume that, the younger you are, the more progressive you are. That no longer seems to be the case. And there's been a lot of speculation why. Bloomberg actually had a very interesting article out today looking at podcasts and, social media influencers and how they have kind of woven in a lot of the same narratives that echo Trump into their podcasts. And they often have done so not by speaking about these issues super directly, but, kind of interweaving narratives about masculinity, loss of power, not liking, I guess, what we used to call political correctness and we now call wokeism. I kind of, a part of my soul dies every time I have to say that word now. But basically this idea that they kind of surround these narratives with talks about jokes and sports and internet drama and all this different kind of stuff, and how they have really changed the conversation. And most adults now listen to at least one podcast a week in terms of getting their information. It's a hugely important source of information, but it does appear to be, at least for young men, to be something that is dominated by MAGA, for lack of a better term. So I think that's really interesting. I think we have to be really careful in how we kind of parse that out. I've seen a lot of knee-jerk reactions of, we need a Joe Rogan of the left. We need a, that's not how this works, right? But to me, I think it's really important to think about in terms of, where individuals are getting their information, where political ideas are being shaped, how this is intersecting with other ideas about, masculinity, wealth, how you should be living your life and stuff like this. And that to me is probably the biggest takeaway so far that I think I personally have had.
That's a lot of good takeaways. And the only short one that I'd add is how, and we knew this, but it's really consolidated now, is how Trump has really taken control of the Republican Party. Look at the nomination of the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, just a few days ago. Hegseth is spectacularly unqualified for this position. In terms of his competence, his experience. He's a violent individual, drinking problems, corruption, like the list is insane. And you still have had 50 of 53 Republican senators vote for him. And in a way, it's a big deal that 3 voted against, but 50 of 53 voted in favor. And with the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote, he becomes the Secretary of Defense. Over the decades, secretaries of defense are typically confirmed with more than 90 votes in the Senate, and sometimes 95, 96, 98. In this case, this is not just a political thing. This is going to have dreadful consequences for American defense, including for allies, and I guess we're going to talk a bit about that in the coming minutes. But the fact that most Republican senators, who in many cases perfectly know how unqualified and unprepared this guy is to be Secretary of Defense, but were browbeaten into voting for him. And others have become converted to the cause and think that he's actually genuinely a good candidate. And it's not always hard to say who's who, but basically that's what the Republican Party is now. And that's the reality we're going to have to live with, not only for the next 4 years, but possibly for a while after that.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just put a cap on that. Thomas and I wrote a book a few years ago, Intelligence and Policy Making, the Canadian Experience, where I think one of the big questions we had, given the relationship between Canada and the United States, particularly on national security issues, is Trumpism going to survive Trump? And I think we have the answer to that question, as Thomas put it succinctly. For now, Trumpism has definitely survived Trump, and not only has Trumpism survived Trump, Trump has survived Trump. So we are in a very different situation.
Yeah, I mean, where does MAGA, or where does the Republican Party go from here? Because it seems like the tone of politics has pretty much been completely turned on its head by the Trump squad. Even people from the outside, like you say, with the podcast community, or Steve Bannon's podcast is enormously popular, and he's not even particularly well liked within Trump circles. And so there does seem to be this kind of hardline movement, even within MAGA, that is going to kind of influence politics going forward. Where do you guys see kind of the mainstream extremism landscape, I guess, from that perspective in about 4 years?
It's very hard to say, though, where the Republican Party is going to go, because on the one hand, those MAGA feelings, perceptions, objectives, whatever you want to call them, they're mobilized and they're extremely strong and know they're not going anywhere. But on the other hand, everything is so centered on the personality of Trump, the strength of his personality, the strength of his threats to browbeat people into following him, and basically his skill in building and sustaining that coalition. And that is an extraordinary level of skill. It's not easy what he did. When he goes, and he's almost 80 now, what happens? Right. And it's actually really not clear. How does Trumpism survive Trump? It will survive Trump in the sense that MAGA feelings are mobilized and they're not going to disappear. But it's not clear to me at all that there is one individual who is going to be able to sustain and keep that coalition together. then the question becomes, what happens when it breaks apart? And that can also lead to pretty scary sub-scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I always say Trump is kind of in the Weberian sense, the first charismatic leader that the U.S. has ever had, right? Because it's not necessarily just like a charismatic person like Obama, but when Weber talks about charisma, it's like he decides what's right and he decides what's good and he decides what's allowed, right? And so that charismatic bond between the MAGA community and Trump, as you say, is what carries it forward. So whatever Trump says is what's good and is what's right, and it's not necessarily going to survive past his kind of personality cult in any unless we find some unless they find someone new.
Well, I mean, Amar, that's actually like, I mean, it's your podcast, but I have a question for you here, because what's interesting to me is like with every other politician, right? Because this is something I've been thinking about. Like with every other politician, like you often judge them on whether or not they have delivered, right? In some way. Like they made the promises, did they deliver on those promises? In a lot of ways now, it's kind of, I feel like we're shifting to like kind of vibes. Are the vibes good? Are the vibes bad? And that seems to determine whether or not you stand a chance. But with regards to Trump, I mean, and like let's take this Colombia agreement, and I want to stress, like, again, you time-stamped this episode and we don't really know what's happening yet. You know, Trump has declared victory. I as of this recording, I don't really know what Colombia's agreed to, but like if Trump says that he's victorious in something, and even if he objectively isn't, his group is probably going to believe him. Like his followers are probably going to believe him. And like, so does it even matter now if he delivers? Like if he says, you know, if he runs like a couple of raids and says, okay, we've done mass migration, you know, we've done mass deportation now, and even if they objectively haven't, do his followers believe him?
No, I mean, I don't think it matters. I mean, I was thinking at least once a week, I think about Sean Spicer standing at the podium talking about the crowd sizes, because
Yeah.
I think that's a really good window into the Trump, like how Trump works, right? It's because it doesn't actually matter that your own eyes are telling you that these are different crowd sizes. It's just like this is the greatest crowd we've ever had, and it's just like great. Now we're just moving forward. So it points to one, how much the actual reality doesn't matter. It's you make your own
Yeah.
reality, and two, how much of his fragility drives some of these politics, right? It's like everyone's just and the Episcopal bishop who just told him to be kind is a good example. Like he was fuming just because he was made to kind of look a little mean in front of his friends, right? And he was talking about that for days and days, had a Truth Social post about it. And so I do think there's a sense that his fragility and people recognizing the fragility around him drive some of these policy choices and how they actually fight it out.
Because that's the first thing I was thinking. The second thing I've been thinking about is, you know, Thomas brought this up, his coalition, right? Does his coalition stay together? Because you do have these true believers, right? The diehard MAGAs, the people who just see him like this. And then you have the far right, which I think some people may like him on the far right, but I think in a lot of cases they just see him as a useful tool to their ends, right? And then the third kind of ingredient here are the tech bros, right? The people, the crypto guys, the tech companies that we've all saw in the front row. And Steve Bannon, like, you know, I want to insert that meme of the worst person you know makes a very good point. But he said, you know, and I'm kind of interested in this, is that he pointed out that, you know, the tech bros being there, it's not, you know, it's not the tech bros owning Trump, it's Trump owning the tech bros now, right? He had them in the front row, but they were on display. He was basically showing, like, these guys belong to me now. This isn't them showing their power, it's Trump showing his power over that as well. So I think that was a really interesting point. But it will be interesting to see, like, you know, if we are in this world where so much of his coalition doesn't need to believe in the reality that's out there, is that the same for the tech bros? Is that the same for the far right, who may say that, you know, Trump did not deliver on the mass deportations that he promised, and then they may be spurred into more radical action?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the hard line of the hard line on the far right just see him as a spectacle in many ways, because it's the same reason, the same way they reacted to Elon Musk's thing. Like, they just want to see everything burn, and they think these guys have the right matches at the right time, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of drives some of their, but the more ideological of the far right, yeah, they are prone to be disappointed when you can't deport and when you can't build the right, a wall tall enough and so on.
On
Come on,
the,
you
you know, on the one point you just mentioned on burning things to the ground, and this is a bit of a cliche as long as it was abstract, but it's going to be very real in the next 4 years. Trump is going to destroy stuff, in some cases fully. In other cases, he'll just severely weaken. And by stuff, I mean institutions, norms, conventions, laws, in many cases. But rebuilding something is extremely difficult. And I know it's a cliche to say that, but it's entirely true. Uh, Rebuilding institutions, new ones, is difficult. That's going to be true after Trump, once somebody, whoever it is, has to rebuild the scorched earth that he'll have left behind. But even during the 4 years of Trump, he's really going to struggle. He doesn't have the patience for that. He's not installing the qualified technocrats that you really do need. People hate technocrats, I get it, but you actually need technocrats to build stuff. And there's a bandwidth issue. And in some cases, it's very cynical to say that, but that'll save us. And by us, I mean like the rest of the world, because he's not going to have time. He's not going to have bandwidth to really do everything he wants to do in a context where it's going to be absolute complete chaos everywhere he goes. That's not good news, because it does imply that he's going to destroy and weaken stuff and that there will be chaos. But it does mean that I simply don't see how he achieves even a fraction of everything he wants to achieve. It's just not possible.
I mean, I guess the devil's advocate pushback I've heard to that argument is that in Trump 1.0, you had kind of the bureaucratic, technocratic center that secretly pushed back against some of his stuff, tried to, mangle some of his policies, get in the way, play defense, whereas those guys are all gone now, it seems.
Yeah, but those guys were getting in the way for the destroy stuff part.
Right.
Right? So he's going to destroy a lot more stuff in Trump 2 than he did in Trump 1. It's the rebuilding part that's going to be extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost, this is like a terrible analogy, but like when the US got to Iraq and they took out all the bureaucrats, right? They did the de-Baathification. Like, so it didn't matter if you believed in it or not. They removed all the people who knew where the levers of government actually were. And all of a sudden, chaos resulted just from this kind of removing everybody. And then they ended up in an insurgency. Now, I'm not saying that's obviously what's going to happen in the United States, but to the point that, if you prevent things from working, I agree with Thomas. There will be chaos. Now, I guess the only question I would have then is he going to care about the chaos? Is he going to care? Like, I mean, there's already some discussion about, the National Institute of Health, all the, medical health experiments that have been delayed, that some of the medical facilities can't even buy food anymore for people who are there. It's pretty crazy. So, but the question is, do they care? If people die, if people get upset? I think the one major indicator that Trump really cares about is the stock market, right? And so I think he is going to evaluate everything that he does based on whether the stock market is higher or lower when he leaves office. And that, to me, will probably be his benchmark of success, whatever remains of the US government. Yeah, of the US, basically, yes.
Well, I mean, I think like people like Maggie Hagerman, who know him quite well, always say, yeah, that he cares about two things: the stock market and the media portrayals of him, right? And he doesn't really care about anything else. He just cares how people see him on the media and the kind of economic fallout. And so those are levers, I guess, the Democrats can pull at and tug at to see. But I guess the media landscape is completely different now, right? I don't know.
He has the media, right? Yeah. Like, he has the media, and I think they're also, their clear strategy is to ignore the mainstream media and to play up to these podcasters that I mentioned earlier, right? Because that's where he believes the real people actually are. And I don't think he's necessarily wrong there. I think he's a pretty savvy media actor for all the other faults, many faults that he has.
Just switching for a moment to kind of the Canadian side of things, there was a bunch of rhetoric from Trudeau's visit to Mar-a-Lago onwards about, us becoming a 51st state and calling, Trudeau governor and all of this. I'm curious how you guys think about those kinds of issues, because on the one hand, I've kind of said, we should not take the bait every time that he talks this way. Run after every squirrel moment. So do you see it as, or I should say, how do you think about the difference between actual issues and then the Trump rhetoric when it comes to these kinds of things, particularly on the Canadian side? Because you do have people like Kevin O'Leary and Danielle Smith who've gone down and do seem to be working with him in, or at least advising him on some capacity. And so, how do you differentiate in your mind between this kind of rhetoric and then what might actually be in store for Canada?
I don't take the rhetoric seriously at all in the literal sense, but it's not to say that it doesn't matter. I mean, will Canada become the 51st state? No, period. I mean, absolutely not. If anything, as a 51st state, we'd vote Democrat, and there's no way that Republicans would agree to that. And it's even absurd to just say that. By the way, there's something like 11% support in the U.S. for making Canada the 51st state. So forget about it. It's just grabbing attention. It's just about hitting on somebody who's down. He's a bully. He wants to hit the weaker players. He's not going to do that on stronger players. It's about softening us up before negotiations, which are going to be difficult. It's the show and the politics around all of it as opposed to the substance. So it does matter when he says that, but not in the literal sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'd be more concerned if I was Greenland or Panama Canal right now. I think those are probably easier targets. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. I agree, but that being said, I think what's interesting as you mentioned, Damar, is the response that it's triggered. And I think what we're seeing, particularly actually within the Conservatives, and I think this is interesting because chances are Conservatives are going to be forming our next government, although we don't know. Within the Conservatives, it's kind of, we've seen a split in terms of how to react. We're seeing the Danielle Smith, as you said, she goes down there. She wants to keep oil and gas going. She wants to make sure that it's not that tariffs, that we aren't, taxing it going into the U.S. or using oil and gas as a lever in this upcoming trade war. And she's talked very openly about giving Trump a win, right? Giving Trump a win. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have Doug Ford, who of course now is running for Premier of Ontario as Captain Canada, has literally made hats that say Canada is not for sale, says, I don't like bullies, I'm going to push back on bullies, and has kind of, at a moment when it's not clear who is the leader, has, for whatever else is going on with Ontario, he has stepped up, right? And so you're seeing this kind of division, I think, within the Conservative side as to how this should work. And so it's almost to me more interesting to see how the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre will handle this, right? In terms of and I think he's actually been fairly quiet about how he is going to handle this. And so what's going to be interesting for me is I think we were going to have an election that was largely about housing, the housing crisis and the carbon tax, and now may very well be about just surviving Trump. And who's best placed to do that. And I think, so this is going to be a huge change for them. More bureaucratically speaking, within the Canadian establishment, I guess, the other thing that's going to be interesting to me is we survived Trump 1 by using strategies like the donut strategy, which is where we kind of went around Trump, right? Trumping in the whole Canadians like donuts. That's why we called it that. It was for real. But, we had this kind of Team Canada approach where premiers, MPs, anyone who had any kind of influence were going to speak to, members of the House of Representatives, governors, senators, all different kind of cabinet levels officials, and saying, look, in this area, X amount of jobs depend on Canada, right? You export X amount to Canada. And this is what's going to happen if you continue these tariffs. And that was a fairly effective strategy leading up into NAFTA 2.0, or I think it's called CUSMA in Canada, or USMCA, or what I like to call USMACA if you're coming from the US. And so it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out, because I'm not convinced that strategy is going to work this time. I think Trump just likes tariffs. I don't think we should ascribe a huge logic to it. I don't think we should, he's not playing 8-dimensional chess. He just likes tariffs. He thinks that Canada has a huge trade advantage with the United States, which really doesn't make any sense. And he's determined, as Thomas said, to come in and wreck things. And so it will be interesting to see how this plays out and how much we get wrecked in the process.
I mean, I agree with you that it's going to be a lot more difficult than Trump 1, and to just say we survived Trump 1, therefore we'll survive Trump 2, is wishful thinking, and it's fantasy.
Absolutely.
That being said, so completely, and there will be tariffs and there will be pain, but I still think that the donut strategy, which has been to varying degrees Canada's strategy for decades, right, remains our least bad option, in the sense that American trade wars, not just with Canada, but with Mexico, with Europeans, with China, are going to seriously damage the American economy. And the best argument, I think, that Canada and others, allies, partners, but also adversaries, have is not anything rational. It's not anything focused on us. It's not anything on the value of alliances, because he does not care about that. The best argument we have, and by we, I mean everybody else, is this is going to hurt American voters. By some measures, a 1-for-1, if the U.S. imposes 25% tariffs on everybody, and everybody imposes a dollar-for-dollar counter tariff, the economic impact on the U.S., we're talking about a serious recession. We're talking about serious spikes in inflation. We're talking about massive job losses in the U.S. That's the most extreme scenario, but that scenario is on the table. That's a scenario that a lot of people in the U.S., including Republicans, really do not want. So it does remain our best strategy, even if it's going to be a lot more difficult than the previous one, to work with Republican members of Congress in Washington and in states, state governors, business councils, too, who have a lot of weight, with who our consulates throughout the U.S. have extensive ties, to really go to them, work with them, and try to apply counter pressure.
Moving to the kind of law enforcement and security agency side, like what I actually just don't remember what happened actually first Trump term. Like, but what do you remember about the Trump 1 experience, with how CSIS RCMP reacted or Five Eyes reacted, and what do you kind of think is going to happen this time around?
Well, for the book that Stephanie mentioned a few minutes ago, Intelligence Analysis and Policymaking, the Canadian Experience, Stephanie and I did 70 interviews in 2018-19. So therefore, towards the end of Trump 1, most of those interviews were with Canadian officials serving and retired, but about a dozen of them were in Washington with both Canadians and Americans. And we asked a lot of questions on the relationship between intelligence and decision-making in Canada in general, but we also asked specific questions about Canada-U.S. relations. And the very clear point that came out of that, which is also the impression Stephanie and I got informally in multiple conversations around town beyond our more formal research, was that at the staff level, at the bureaucratic level, at the executive level, below president-prime minister relations, which were difficult, security and intelligence relations remain very good between Canada and the U.S. They remain very integrated, very close, and so on. That's true. And that maybe has led to a bit of complacency on the Canadian side. Going back to this point again, we survived Trump 1. We actually did reasonably well. We did not suffer. Therefore, we'll be okay for Trump 2. Looking forward, I am absolutely not convinced that that same cushion, right, of the depth of the integration between the two sides, that is still going to shield us in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I would echo that. It's really, especially if you're looking at who Trump is appointing to what position. So again, we don't know because these individuals have not yet been confirmed, but like someone like Tulsi Gabbard in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, like that is bad news, right? This is someone who is clearly had been meeting with like Russian, Syrian officials, very, pro authoritarian regime, to put it mildly, conspiracy theorist, denied the use of chemical weapons being used in Syria, like just really nuts. Just awful. Yeah. And then Kash Patel, who is just, again, he is going to turn the FBI in on itself, right? he is going, I mean, he's going to turn, like, he's going to create a witch hunt within the FBI and go after anyone who had anything to do with the January 6th prosecutions. So I really think that this is going to be a bad thing, in the sense that, you know, and I think this is what we felt at the beginning of Trump 1, that, you know, the intelligence community itself is a fierce bureaucratic fighter. And if it is consumed with internal battles, it's not paying attention to, you know, the intelligence and national security stuff that is supposed to be doing. And that's bad for Canada because they share so much information with us, right? Like, they just, we get so much information from the US. We are entirely dependent on that. That's a political decision we have made over and over and over again. And here we are. So if the US community itself is in disarray, that inherently affects us, because it just means that the collection and efforts will not be as strong as they once were. The only final proviso I would put on that is that I have had conversations with senior national security intelligence officials in the last few months since the election, and they have said quite openly, they've said it doesn't matter. We have to work with the US. We have no choice, right? So unless they cut us off, we will continue intelligence sharing with them, right? Unless we don't really have a choice, but I think we should be prepared for serious disruption caused by some of these Trump appointees in the next, at least the next year or two.
Can you talk a little bit about the specifics in terms of country? Like, what are you seeing, or what are you anticipating with Iran, Russia, China, Israel, Palestine, going forward? Like, what kind of changes might you be expecting?
I mean, looking on the Middle East side, there will be some change. There will be some continuity too. I mean, it's always important not to exaggerate the extent to which everything changes when we go from one administration to another, even when we go to a Trump one. But things will change. My view on the American approach to the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and also Iran, is that in many cases they haven't fully resolved internal debates as to what the policy will be. On Israel-Palestine, of course, they will stay very strongly pro-Israel. And there's no doubt about that. And if anything, more than under Biden. But there are people around Trump, possibly Trump himself, who really does want a push to some kind of solution. Now, what solution means can be extremely dependent on who you talk to. But just look at the case of the ceasefire. There's already a lot of pressure in Israel to move away from the ceasefire with Hamas, and certainly not to go beyond phase 1, which is the phase we're in now, supposed to last 6 weeks, exchange of a small number of hostages for prisoners. A lot of people on the far right, including in Netanyahu's coalition, don't want to go any more beyond that, want the war against Hamas to continue. But that would be, in a way, a repudiation of Trump's very strong support for a ceasefire. You've already had some people around Trump, including Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, saying, no, we are committed to seeing the full 3 phases of the ceasefire agreement being implemented. So what's going to be the American position on that? As of now, I don't know. Ultimately, it's going to come down to Trump for sure. But there is a range of views around him on this issue. And I think that we're only 1 week as we record this in the Trump administration. So it's normal in a way, as abnormal as this administration is, that these policy debates are not resolved. But on the Middle East, there is some scope. And I won't get into detail for time, but on Iran, it's a bit the same thing. You've got some people around Trump who want to push for regime change, for maximum pressure on Iran. But you've got other people around Trump who want a new nuclear deal, who want a sweeping deal to resolve, quote unquote, whatever that means, 45 years of U.S. enmity with Iran. Where will Trump come down on that? I actually don't know. I don't think it's clear yet.
Is there a scenario in which you think having Trump's personality and way of governance is actually good for how global conflicts? Because I'm just thinking about Israel-Palestine and the ceasefire, which they clearly seem to have a lot of impact on the Trump administration. Yep. I mean, is there something about the force of his personality and his unpredictability that is good?
Well, I mean, so to be clear, on average, Trump will be a disaster for international security and stability, for the progress of democracy, and so on. So on average, it will not be good. And I have absolutely no doubt about that. Alliances, human rights, democracy, and so on. Right. That being said, it can't necessarily be all bad. And the ceasefire in Gaza is a good example. I can't prove that, but I think, and a number of watchers of the Middle East think, that in the absence of Trump's pressure, there would not have been a ceasefire deal in Gaza. And I think it's most likely true to say that. We hate to say that, but it's the reality, and we have to deal with the reality as it is. Could that be true in the case of other conflicts, perhaps Ukraine, on which I'm not an expert, Israel-Palestine itself? It could. It could, but it could go multiple ways, especially if the deal that he does try to eventually impose is one that heavily leans in favor of Israel and against actual recognition of statehood for Palestinians, and beyond the issue of statehood, dignity and security. So could be good, but could not be that good. But on average, no, I don't think it will be good.
Yeah, on the other regions of the world, let's start with the Indo-Pacific. It's interesting. Like, I mean, I think Trump's view of the Indo-Pacific was largely shaped by Shinzo Abe, right? The former Prime Minister of Japan, who has been assassinated and is no longer there, which is awful. Any assassination is obviously awful, but also, someone who was kind of a Trump whisperer for Japan is no longer available to them. But for whatever reason, he had a really, really good relationship with Abe. So it's going to be interesting. Trump has come in, we're all familiar with him going China, 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 or whatever. That's right. I apologize for that Trump impression. It's pretty bad. But he seems to be softening. He's now talking about a 10% tariff on all Chinese goods as opposed to a 25%. I think it's notable he's going after Canada before he goes after China in terms of talks. And a lot of the tech guys around him may be trying to push for a softened approach to China. And certainly I think we're seeing that in terms of the rhetoric coming out of the administration. Now, that could change on a dime. I'm not going to pretend it's not, but I do think it's notable that there could be that. Now, I think that's maybe generally good news for the world economy, but possibly bad news then for countries like Taiwan, where the U.S. may not want to be giving military aid in the way that it had been, certainly under Biden, certainly under parts of Trump 1. Now, that will come to the annoyance of a lot of the China hawks that are definitely within the MAGA coalition. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think there's potentially a real opening for Chinese-American relations if that's the direction. This is a huge if that's the direction where Trump wants to go. The
direction that China wants to go.
And the direction that China wants to go as well. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the news out, I think today about like the new Chinese artificial intelligence that has come out and really surprised a lot of watchers in this area. Maybe a good example of the kind of global competition that then spooks Trump into action, right? So all of this is a big if. I would just note that the conversation coming out of that Trump camp isn't what it was even maybe 2 months ago. The other thing that, I think stands out, of course, is Ukraine. I think this is the other big issue that he will have to deal with. And of course, he's talks a lot about, the Russia hoax, how Russia never would have invaded Ukraine if he was president, and all these different kinds of things. And I think there's a lot of speculation that he wants to end support for Ukraine. But the thing that may be holding him back is, strangely enough, Afghanistan. Where he saw the chaos from the U.S. pull out of Afghanistan that resulted, and he doesn't necessarily want to own that. I think he actually does want some kind of deal. Now, that is going to mean Ukraine probably giving up some of the things that it doesn't want to give up, and certainly Russia is pushing harder than it ever has to take territory, probably understanding that it is in the lead up to some kind of negotiations. But, I mean, the first posts that Trump has made on Ukraine have been about the need for Russia to make a deal. Not Zelensky, but Putin, to be like, hey, you need to come to the table. We're going to start putting more sanctions on you. And so that's interesting. So I want to very much support, all this to say, I very much support, I think, what Thomas said. I think for the general global picture with regards to democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, human rights, an just solution for some of these terrible conflicts. I mean, Sudan is totally neglected. We're seeing terrible things happen right now in the Congo with M23 just running over and taking cities. Really, really horrible events. Nothing good is probably going to come out of this for the next little while. But on these kind of major issues that have been kind of touchstones of U.S. foreign policy, we may at least see ceasefires, if not maybe the kind of just solutions that we would have wanted.
So final question, just because we're kind of running out of time here. What and you can both kind of take your turns at this, is what keeps you up at night? What are some of the I guess, what's, not to mix metaphors, but like what's kind of break glass in case of emergency moment that you think you will keep an eye out for in your respective research areas? Like what are one or two things that might happen that will absolutely kind of freak you out if it does happen?
So for me, it's not necessarily
yeah.
it's not necessarily break glass. It's I'm looking at the glass and I feel like there's already 1,000 little cracks in it, and I'm waiting for it to shatter itself. And again, what I really do worry about, less about international affairs, less about moments, but I do worry about this long-term impact of the death and radical shift of the information environment, right? That people now can pick and choose their own realities, and we're seeing the impact of that on our politics. And I don't think any of this is going to go away anytime soon. I think Trump can bring about economic catastrophe. I think he can, have terrible things happen in the United States. And I still think he will have many, many, many people support him, just because they're going to be listening to people who are saying, yeah, this is not Trump. This is, the mole people, Jewish space lasers. I don't know, but like, they're going to be coming up with many different reasons why Trump is still the answer. Why they're always going to be like, revolutions need target. I understand MAGA as a revolution, right? And revolutions always need targets to point to and chomp on. And that's what is I think the product of this information environment. So I'm not at all optimistic. That is what keeps me up at night. And yeah, I'm just going to hide under my desk after this podcast.
I mean, as a Canadian and looking from a Canadian national interest perspective, the one thing that keeps me up at night would be the threat of severe economic pain by the Americans. That's the one existential thing. The U.S. cutting off, in part, the tap of intelligence sharing would hurt, right? It could even hurt a lot, and I don't want to minimize that at all. But 25% tariffs in the long term, and if we apply counter tariffs and they don't work, we're talking about serious economic pain and large scale negative economic growth and so on. Just to cheat on your question, the one thing I'll mention, putting on my Middle East hat as opposed to my Canadian hat, is just a number of things that can go bad in the Middle East in the next 4 years. Of course, it's been tragedy after tragedy after tragedy for decades in the region, but so many things could go wrong. Violence in Yemen could flare up again, country that I work on a lot. Syria, a moment of absolute euphoria in December when Assad fell, which is one of the best news we've had from the region in a very long time, but a lot could still go wrong in the post-Assad environment in Syria. Israel-Palestine, the absence of any prospect for a resolution to that dispute and for a Palestinian state, which remains the only long-term viable solution to all of this. Prospects don't look good. Gaza is, apocalyptically destroyed. What happens now that there's a ceasefire, right? Who governs? Who feeds? Who picks up the trash? And so on. Who provides clean water? And so on. And we could just go around the Middle East and find a number of other hotspots like that, but these are some of the key ones.
Well, on that positive note, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Steph. We'll maybe revisit in like 8 months to see if all of our predictions and statements,
how much worse things have gotten.
Assuming we can still afford to turn the lights on.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Cheers.
Thank you.